Margaret Rose had always been different from what her father, Harold, expected in a daughter. Growing up in the small coastal town of Cedar Bay, she spent her summers not playing with dolls, but watching the ships come and go from the harbour while other girls her age were learning to bake and sew. Margaret was reading maritime history and dreaming of adventures beyond the horizon. Harold Patterson had built his construction company from nothing, working 16-hour days to provide for his family. He understood hard work and traditional values, but he struggled to understand his daughter's unconventional dreams. When Margaret announced at 17 that she wanted to attend the Naval Academy, Harold felt his world shift. The dinner table grew quiet that evening as Margaret explained her decision. Her mother, Helen, reached across to squeeze her hand, but Harold pushed back from the table and walked to the window overlooking their modest backyard. "The Navy is no place for a young woman," he said, without turning around. "You should be thinking about marriage and starting a family like other girls your age." But Margaret had inherited her father's stubborn determination, even if he couldn't see it. She applied to the Naval Academy despite his disapproval, and when her acceptance letter arrived, Harold barely spoke to her for weeks. The years that followed tested their relationship in ways neither had anticipated. Margaret excelled at the academy, earning respect from her peers and instructors alike. She called home every Sunday, but the conversations with her father remained strained and formal. He would ask about her studies in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather after graduation. Margaret's career flourished. She served on destroyers and cruisers, earning commendations for her leadership and tactical skills. Each promotion brought a brief phone call home where Harold would listen politely but offer little praise. His silence spoke louder than any words of disapproval. Helen tried to bridge the gap between them. "She's making you proud, Harold, even if you won't admit it," she would say after Margaret's calls. But Harold remained convinced that his daughter had chosen a path that would lead only to disappointment. Years passed like pages in a book. Margaret served in the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. She led humanitarian missions and earned the respect of sailors who had initially questioned whether a woman belonged on their ships. Her mother saved every newspaper clipping, every mention of Margaret's achievements in a scrapbook that Harold pretended not to notice. When Margaret met Lieutenant Commander James Sullivan at a joint training exercise, something in her letters home changed. She wrote about his kindness and his shared love of the ocean, about quiet conversations on deck under starlit skies. Helen recognized the tone of a woman in love. James was everything Margaret could have hoped for in a partner. He understood her dedication to service and supported her ambitions without trying to diminish them. When he asked Harold for Margaret's hand in marriage during a tense visit to Cedar Bay, Harold gave his permission, but his manner remained distant. The wedding planning became another source of friction. Harold wanted a simple ceremony at the local church, followed by dinner at the community centre. Margaret envisioned something that honoured both her love for James and her naval career. They compromised on a beachside ceremony that satisfied neither completely. As the wedding day approached, Harold's discomfort grew. He watched the preparations with increasing anxiety, muttering about the expense and the unconventional nature of everything Margaret had planned. The guest list included colleagues from Margaret's naval career, people Harold had never met and didn't understand. Helen tried to reason with him. "This is our daughter's day, Harold. She deserves your support." But Harold seemed unable to move past his own expectations of what his daughter's life should have looked like. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful. The ceremony was set for 4 in the afternoon on the beach where Margaret had spent countless hours as a child dreaming of distant shores. White chairs were arranged in rows facing the ocean, and an archway of flowers framed the spot where Margaret and James would exchange vows. Margaret had chosen to wear her dress uniform for the ceremony, a decision that sparked their final argument. "There, night before, you're wearing a uniform to your own wedding," Harold had said, shaking his head. "It's disgraceful, Margaret. This is supposed to be the most important day of your life, and you're treating it like another day at the office." The words hung between them, heavy with years of accumulated disappointment. Margaret looked at her father with tears in her eyes. "This uniform represents who I am, Papa. It represents years of service and sacrifice. Why can't you be proud of that?" Harold turned away without answering, and Margaret went to bed, wondering if her father would even walk her down the aisle. The next morning, Harold dressed in his best suit, the one he had worn to Helen's funeral 2 years earlier. Margaret's mother had passed peacefully, in her sleep, leaving behind a husband who had never learned to express his feelings, and a daughter who had inherited his stubborn pride. As guests began arriving at the beach, Harold noticed how many people wore military uniforms. Men and women of various ranks moved with the precise bearing that marked them as professional sailors. Margaret greeted each one warmly, clearly beloved by her colleagues. Harold felt increasingly out of place among these strangers. His discomfort grew when he overheard conversations about Margaret's recent promotion and her exemplary service record. These people spoke of his daughter with genuine respect and admiration, yet he had spent years disapproving of the very career they celebrated. The ceremony began with Margaret walking alone down the sandy aisle. Harold had chosen at the last minute to take his seat rather than escort her, a decision that surprised the guests and hurt Margaret deeply. She maintained her composure, but James saw the flash of pain in her eyes as she walked toward him without her father's support. The officiant spoke beautifully about love and commitment, about two people choosing to support each other's dreams, rather than demanding they change. Margaret and James exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to honor each other's service to their country and their commitment to each other as they were pronounced husband and wife. The assembled naval personnel rose as one, creating an archway of raised swords for the couple to pass beneath. It was a moment of breathtaking beauty and tradition that brought tears to many eyes. But Harold chose that moment to voice his long-held frustrations. Standing abruptly, he spoke loudly enough for many to hear. "You're wearing a uniform to your wedding. This is disgraceful, Margaret. You've turned what should be the most beautiful day of your life into some kind of military parade." The beach fell silent. Margaret's face flushed with embarrassment and hurt, while James moved protectively to her side. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected outburst. Harold continued his voice, carrying across the sand. "I raised a daughter, not a soldier. I wanted grandchildren and Sunday dinners, not phone calls from halfway around the world. This whole thing is just wrong." Margaret stood frozen, caught between her love for her father and her hurt at his public rejection of who she had become. The moment stretched painfully as Harold's words echoed across the beach. Then something remarkable happened. From the back rows where many of Margaret's naval colleagues sat, a figure began to rise. Tall and distinguished with silver hair and countless ribbons on his dress uniform, Admiral Robert Chen stepped forward. His movement caught the attention of other officers, who began standing in recognition. One by one, then dozens at a time, the naval personnel rose to their feet. Their posture was perfect, their expressions serious. As they stood, a murmur began moving through their ranks, growing stronger until it became a unified call. "Admiral on deck." The words rang across the beach, clear and strong, as 200 voices spoke in unison. Harold turned in confusion, looking round at the sea of standing figures. He had no idea what was happening, or why everyone was suddenly at attention. Admiral Chen stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of decades of naval service. "Sir, with respect, I believe there's something you should know about your daughter." Harold looked from the Admiral to Margaret, who stood with tears streaming down her face, not from embarrassment now, but from overwhelming emotion. 3 weeks ago, the Admiral continued, "Your daughter was selected for promotion to Admiral. She will be one of the youngest flag officers in naval history." The announcement was delayed at her request because she wanted to enjoy her wedding without the ceremony being overshadowed by official business. The beach remained silent except for the sound of waves against the shore. Harold stared at his daughter, seeing her as if, for the first time, the uniform that had embarrassed him suddenly looked different, bearing the weight of extraordinary achievement. "Admiral Chen wasn't finished. Your daughter has served with distinction in every assignment. She has led sailors through dangerous waters and brought them home safely. She has represented our country with honor and grace. Captain Margaret Patterson Sullivan is the finest officer I have had the privilege to serve." Alongside, the silence stretched. As Harold absorbed these words, he looked at his daughter, still standing beside her new husband, still wearing the uniform that represented a lifetime of dedication and service. Margaret spoke softly, her voice carrying across the quiet beach. "I never told you, Papa, because I wanted to wait until after the wedding. I wanted to die.